All right, before we leave this topic, give me some feedback from patients who've actually navigated this whole framework, and they're on the CGRPR antagonists. What's life like for them?
So we're seeing a very mixed bag. So my group has about 6,500 people in it. It's not the biggest migraine group, but it is almost the biggest CGRP group. We're having all sorts of experiences along the spectrum, from people who actually receive the medication in a timely manner, have found that they are responding in some way or other that is, let's say, 50% or more, so they're relatively happy. And there are people who are saying, this is life-changing, I'm getting my life back, it's phenomenal, it's a miracle drug, I can do math again, I can go back to work, I can actually play with my child. So that is on the positive side of the spectrum. All the way on the other side of the spectrum, we're finding that patients are feeling a lot of concern about the way the clinical trials were structured. There was a sense that the population used in the clinical trials was not fully representative of the real world migraine population. And there is a sense among patients that they're being left out of the conversation in how these medications are actually working in the real world. So there's a kind of a fear there and anxiety. And then there's all the people in between, especially the ones who say, well, I got 50% better, but I still have 15 migraine days a month. So what do I do now? Do I try a different medication? Or they're concerned because of the layering issue, which is where, let's say they were taking Botox, and now they're being told you can't have Botox and a CGRP inhibitor, so they're being taken off Botox, which can have devastating impact.
And they crash.
And they crash, exactly.
The whole idea, here's an interesting problem. With cheap drugs, you can combine as many as you want. With expensive drugs, all of a sudden you can't. Right. And there's theoretical scientific evidence that the best combination treatment would be Botox and an antibody. Botox works on one set of fibers. The antibodies work on a different set of fibers. And basically our paradigm is that our failures are Botox failures, and we add the antibody to Botox, and eventually we'll know what happens if we can discontinue the Botox. But the companies say, well, they haven't been tested, and therefore you can't approve both of them. But I can tell you 90% of the combinations that will be used that are approved have never been tested, and there's no evidence for it, yet we're allowed to use it. Now, what I'm really stating is the fact that the criteria come from cost, not from science.
There's a lot of folks who've said to me, I love evidence-based medicine, and as soon as I get some evidence, I'd be happy to use it. But there's a lot of stuff out there that has not been studied adequately long-term, and yet these patients are suffering. And if you restrict your dispensing to patients who absolutely meet the evidence-based criteria, you're going to be leaving a lot of her friends out in the cold.
Well, you know, for us is evidence, right? So if there's published literature that supports the combination use, actually one of the criteria for use of CGRPs is that there's a washout period with respect to Botox.
Why?
So, well, perhaps because that's how the clinical trials were designed?
They weren't, well, here's the problem with that. If you wash out Botox and the patients crash, they'll wind up being hospitalized. We actually use CGRP in the presence of Botox, often because we can get a sample. And then if they do well, we'll then move them along to prescription Botox, to the prescription that. I mean, there's absolutely no reason in the world that you have to wash it out. That was done for a clinical trial to prove the fact that it was the same for any other prevention. All of the studies except for Teva demanded no concomitant prevention. Does that mean if you're in topiramate, you have to wash topiramate out before you go on that? It was for statistical separation. The only trial that allowed a concomitant drug was Teva, and they allowed topiramate, and again, to our surprise, topiramate worked, the antibodies worked just as well, whether or not the topiramate was present. Okay. So therefore, we have good scientific evidence, at least for topiramate, they were synergistic. The cost of these trials are enormous, and to design a trial with or without Botox, with or without placebo, with or without active drug, would be $100 million. So I think the only way we can do it is real life.
It would be real world, it would be meta-analysis, but you know, if there's published literature, I think that helps at getting us to agree rather than be on the camp of
I'm not disagreeing with you, but there's no scientific basis except for bad trial design, which is based to get FDA approval and has nothing to do with real life. Let me assume, for the sake of argument, if you had AIDS and you were on an anti-HIV medicine and a new one came along, would you make people stop all the drugs before they got it, even though there was no scientific evidence that it was studied that way? So why do you do it for migraine? Because it's a second-rate disorder, right? Unless you had
Well,
it.
Usually when you're talking about high-cost drugs and you're looking at what's the literature to support it for efficacy and for safety, usually there's a moment to educate us if there is.
No, I'm not
literature.
disagreeing with you, but what I'm really stating is there are different criteria based on your perception of how bad the disorder is. And it's like the Zebel quotes scripture for his own benefit. And my problem is taking an aspect of trial design was designed to, as your patients say, the trial wasn't, except for the Teva trial, had no concomitant medication. Why? With the belief being that you're on a drug, it would blunt the effect. That's why it was done. And basically we've shown that it's synergistic with topiramate, and there are trials that are now going to be done showing that they're synergistic with CGRP antagonists. And the reason they were done before is we didn't know while we were doing the trials if they were better or worse and what would happen. So trials are like science experiments, they're not real life. So I would take objection to saying, I can agree that you wouldn't pay for both, but the washout to me is brutal.